Good evening to everyone and welcome to today's session. In the last session, we discussed on acidosis, proximal and distal renal tubular acidosis. I hope you had an opportunity to review it in this class. But we personally felt addressing RTA without discussing the basics of acid-base disturbances would not be a very good attempt. So let us re-review once more the concepts of acid-base disturbances before we continue our discussion in nephrology. So doc, what is anion gap? You heard this as a student of physiology, right? Sodium, which is a positive ion, minus chloride plus bicarbonate will give you an anion gap. Normally sodium is around 145, around 142, 135 to 145. Minus chloride is 109, bicarbonate is 24 milliequivalents, and that will give you around 12 is the normal anion gap. Now what are the cations which are present in our plasma, doctor? We have sodium, potassium, ammonium, calcium, magnesium. These are all called cations. We have chloride, bicarbonate, sulfate, phosphate and some organic anions, like for example ketone bodies. They are what? Organic anions. Now what are we doing basically to calculate anion gap? We are subtracting chloride and bicarbonate, which are anions, from the sodium, which is cation. Then why don't you call it as cation gap? Why do you want to call anion gap? Because on one side we are saying anion gap, other side we are subtracting anions from cations. Then why do we call it as anion gap? It's a very common sense question. So doctor, in the anions we have two kinds. Measurable anion, which is chloride, unmeasurable anion, which include sulfate, phosphate and organic anions. Similarly, among cations, we have sodium and potassium, but calcium, magnesium, ammonium, they are all called unmeasurable cations. So if you combine this, that is chloride plus unmeasured anions is equivalent to sodium plus potassium plus unmeasured cations. If you rearrange this equation, what will happen? Unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations is equivalent to sodium plus potassium minus chloride. So whenever we say anion gap, in true sense it is a gap between unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations, which is calculated by measured cations minus measured anions, is what you have to basically understand. Now what are the various unmeasured anions? We have anionic proteins, phosphates, sulfates and organic anions. These are all what? Unmeasured anions. I will give you one situation. We call diabetic ketoacidosis what kind of situation? High anion gap metabolic acidosis. What is the meaning of it? In diabetic ketoacidosis, ketone bodies are produced which are unmeasured anions, and the unmeasured anions have increased, so that unmeasured anions minus unmeasured cations, which is the anion gap value, also has increased, and hence diabetic ketoacidosis is a high anion gap metabolic acidosis. You all agree with me? Now we say uremia is a high anion gap metabolic acidosis. Why? Because Urea is another unmeasured anion. When in uremia, the urea, which is because what is urea? Urea is an organic anion. So that is the reason in uremia, when urea level is increased, unmeasured anion value increased, unmeasured anion minus unmeasured cation value also will increase, which will increase the anion gap. Hence uremia is also an example of high anion gap metabolic acidosis is what I want to underscore to all of you. So we have lactate, acetoacetate, sulfate. These are all acidic anions which are produced during metabolic acidosis. They are not measured, and when the acidosis is because of them, then that lead to a acidosis which is of high anion gap type is what you have to remember. Okay, doc? So that is the reason today only you go to the ward and ask your postgraduate, how do you calculate anion gap Anna? अरे इसमें क्या है, सोडियम प्लस पोटेशियम माइनस क्लोराइड, correct na? Then you are subtracting chloride, which is anion, from sodium plus potassium cation. Then why are you not calling it as cation gap? Where is the cat gone? I still remember asking the same question the same way as a house surgeon. So lot of people don't appreciate when we say anion gap, it is not chloride and bicarbonate. Chloride and bicarbonate are what? Measurable anions. We are talking about unmeasurable anions like lactate, acetoacetate, sulfate, urea, etc., etc. Now broadly, if you take high anion gap metabolic acidosis, that is acidosis where there is a high anion gap, they fall into two groups: lactic acidosis, non-lactic acidosis. Non-lactic acidosis include uremia, ketoacidosis, ethylene glycol, methanol, isonic acid, salicylate intoxication. Salicylate is also another example of a organic anion. When intoxication is there, organic anion level is high and acidosis is of high anion gap kind of a metabolic acidosis. Then in the lactic acidosis you have type A, type B. Type A means whenever there is a hypoxemia or a cardiac arrest or a hypoperfusion, which is a stimulating scenario for a anaerobic glycolysis and that produces excess lactic acid, then that is called type A lactic acidosis. Whereas one of the enzymes of the glycolysis is affected, or if there is any toxin which is affecting the glycolysis, then also there is a production of excess lactic acid, which is basically called type B type of a lactic acidosis is what I want to underscore to all of you. Now doctor, basically we have 4 types of acid base disturbances. Anywhere you go, tomorrow in intensive care unit, if you want to work confidently as a house surgeon, acute medical care unit, what is the simplest thing you must know to manage, doctor? Acidosis, acid base disturbances, and dyselectrolytemias. Hyponatremia, somebody is in altered sensorium, somebody is dehydrated with hypernatremia, somebody is having hyperkalemia going into cardiac arrest, somebody into hypokalemia and in a paralytic state. How to rescue? You must know the basics. Similarly, how to manage acid base disturbances. What is meant by respiratory acidosis? Remember, very simple fact. In our body, if at all acid is produced, there are only 2 ways by which it can be produced. We produce a lot of endogenous acids whenever we are having metabolism, like lactic acid, urea, etc. But they are all bufferable. Who buffers them? In our body, there are a lot of buffering agents. Hemoglobin is a buffering agent, proteins are buffering agents, bicarbonate is a buffering agent, Kidney has an ability to excrete the H plus produced in the body and buffers. That is a continuous process. Second source of acid production is volatile acid. It is called as carbon dioxide. Carbon dioxide combines with water to form carbonic acid, which releases H plus ion, and that is the volatile acid. Why it's called volatile? We don't want carbon dioxide. If you overbreathe, hyperventilate, you can get rid of CO2 from the body. Then the acid levels in the body will come down. You have a respiratory depression. You can't expire and expel the carbon dioxide. All that carbon dioxide combines with water and lead to acidosis. So respiratory depression leads to acidosis. Respiratory hyperventilation leads to alkalosis, as all of you know very well. Then we have what is called metabolic acidosis. This all of you are experts. What are the two kinds of metabolic acidosis that you know? High anion gap, normal anion gap, metabolic acidosis. High anion gap, in turn you know, lactic acidosis or non-lactic acid type. Non-lactic acid type include uremia, ketoacidosis, salicylate intoxication, etc., etc. Right? So that is metabolic acidosis.